In today's session, we concern ourselves with the relationship of war to the emergence of the political form, the social form that we inhabit all in today's world, the state, or more precisely, the nation state. And in doing so, we will need to understand what the state is as a specific entity, as a specific political unit, and what its relationship to violence is, both in its external and internal characteristics. One of the places to start really is with the famous statement from the historian Charles Tilly, in which he explains that war made the state and the state made war. And to some degree, what we are going to try to do in this session is to elucidate that claim between regarding the relationship of war and state, how one made the other, how they both made one another, and we'll seek to begin to examine how this claim might still apply or not in the contemporary world. In particular, what we were trying to explore is a set of what we might call feedback loops, which is to say mutually causal relations that feed back into one another, ways in which the key components of war, state, and capitalism interacted with one another in a manner so to reinforce each other's development and give rise to the key features of the modern world. First, we should start really by defining what we mean by the state. And perhaps the most famous of those definitions, certainly the one that would be most practical for us, is that offered by the German sociologist Max Weber. Weber explains, the state is the form of human community that lays claim to the monopoly of the legitimate use of violence within a given territory. So, quite a lot there that we need to unpack. First of all, this notion of a legitimate monopoly over the means of violence. This is crucial for our purposes. This is the idea that the state is a concentration of the capacity to wield violence, but not also merely of the capacity, but of its legitimacy, which is to say that it is recognized as the only legitimate form or legitimate wielder of violence. And of course, the institution or the entity that determines this is the state itself. This also means, of course, that the state can in itself decide on forms of violence wielded by other actors that can be considered to be legitimate. So, for instance, states can bring in military corporations, can bring in mercenary forces and grant them the right to use violence. But it is the state that continues to control the ability to determine what is legitimate and what is a legitimate form of violence. So we want to hold to our mind this, in an important fashion, this definition that Tilly himself insists on, that the state is above all a coercion-wielding organization. So it's key for us to understand that the state is very intimately bound to the capacity for violence. Another facet of the state that is important to us is that it is an entity that is marked by political centralization. A state is a hierarchical organization, whether it's led explicitly by a sovereign, a monarch, or whether it is led by an elected representative or assortment of representatives. Fundamentally, it obeys a vertical distribution of power. Indeed, states are intensely bureaucratic organizations that handle authority and exercise power through various levels of bureaucratic fiat. This also means in modern states that roles, positions of influence and power are ones that are integrated within a bureaucratic structure where individuals fulfill specific roles within determined institutions, and which contrasts with pre-modern forms of authority, which are often much more personalized and fluctuating in accordance with the people who fill these positions. Finally, the state is inherently a territorial organization. It reigns or rules over a territorially demarcated area. A state has an inside, its own territory, and an outside, that which lies beyond it. And for states, the managing, the delineation, the policing, the defending of borders is critical to the very existence of a state, in a way that is much sharper than with pre-existing political entities. For instance, empires. Typically, an empire has a very ill-formed set of borders and boundaries, where as you get further from the center, its power weakens, but it doesn't necessarily have a very strict border. States are much more attached to this notion of the border. In a way, what we are talking about with all this is a key concept that we have to keep in mind, which is that of sovereignty, associated in the first instance with a literal sovereign, a king, a monarch, but which over time has now become to be associated much more synonymously with the state's own authority, capacity to possess exclusive power and jurisdiction over a determined area. We find this idea of sovereignty plays a key role in Western European political theory. We find that idea expressed very powerfully in the work of Thomas Hobbes and his work of political theory, Leviathan. And in Leviathan, Hobbes makes a case for a theory of political sovereignty, advocates for a exclusive authority granted in the state, but ultimately, in his mind, in the figure of the sovereign. And which is why when we look at the frontispiece, the cover of Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, we see the following picture of a king who is represented as the amalgamation of his subjects. He is a collective being who has been empowered, Hobbes thinks through a form of social contract, to exert this authority in the name of the people. We see in this picture that the sovereign here on the one hand wields a sword, the symbol of physical power, violence, military or other, and at the same time a ceremonial staff indicating his anointment through God. Now, Hobbes describes and the foundation of sovereignty by reference to some supposed state of nature in which there was no sovereign and therefore a general war of all against all, and he sees this contract almost as a sudden rupture with that state of war against all against all. But of course, in reality, the historical monopolization of violence was a very slow and incremental process that gave rise over time, and not necessarily as part of any intended scheme, to what we would recognize today as modern nation states, where, for those that are functional today, hold a very powerful monopoly of violence. So if we were to look at this historical process, what we would see is that it occurred in a variety of ways. First of all, it occurred internally, domestically, in territories in which central authorities, again, typically in the first instance through kings and monarchs, were progressively able to disarm their domestic rivals, the civilian population as a whole, so that weapons were seized, control was asserted over the production of weapons, criminalization or the licensing of the private bearing of arms was established, private armies were outlawed. So increasingly only the monarch, the sovereign, and the state that they were the emanation of, or the representative of, could possess the means of violence. We can see, in fact, how far this extends, this monopolization of violence, and the way in which it effectively broke with a pre-existing social order in which the means of violence were much more distributed, and in which there was no central authority that could tightly regulate the uses of this violence. For instance, in the progressive outlawing of duels. So think of those duels that aristocrats might organize if one party felt they had been offended by the other and would seek redress. They might organize a duel, whether it was to be fought with swords or pistols. Now, this is one of the things that fledgling states progressively outlawed, and rather than it being a merely trivial matter of public order, it's significant in a sense because what it also established was that disputes between private citizens could only ultimately be resolved through the institutions of the state, namely through the courts. And if any use of violence and punishment had to be meted out, this would have to be determined in the courts through these sovereign institutions and not at the discretion of these private citizens. Again, particularly aristocrats who represented an alternative order, or typically a challenge to the predominant monarch. Indeed, this is one of the very important parts of the story, which is the move away from a feudal order in which power was widely distributed, where there might be a king of France or king of England, but that king relied, or queen, relied heavily on the support of local feudal powers. In other words, individuals who possessed their private armies, their supporters, who would have to contribute if the kingdom was to enter into a war, and so forth. So one of the things that we see arriving by the end of the 17th century is the rise of so-called absolutism. That's to say, monarchies concentrating power as had previously not been seen. For instance, in the reign of Louis XIV in France, subsequently Frederick the Great of Prussia. Emerging states forms that were still very much reliant on the old monarchical ideals, but in which progressively the feudal basis of support for these monarchies had been eroded. Effectively, they had these competitors, because most of the time the struggles for the leadership of these territories happened between these feudal groups. Either these groups had been eliminated, removed, or co-opted, brought into the fledgling bureaucracy of the state, so that individuals could retain some of their relative prestiges in the social structure, but without the autonomy of power that they once held. So summing up, between 1400 and 1700, what we see in Europe is rulers spending much of their efforts disarming, isolating, and co-opting rival claimants to state power with the power that they, effectively through either coercion or bringing in co-opting into the existing state or the developing state structure. So there's a first form of monopoly of violence, or first dynamic of monopoly of violence that appears to us when we look at some of the internal processes within certain territories. But the monopolization of violence was not simply a domestic process. It was simultaneously an international one. So it's important to understand that really when we think about the emergence of the state as a dominant political actor in the world, it comes at the same time as the emergence of an international system, an international state system. So it isn't so much that states emerge and then the aggregation of states give us an international system, but rather that these two things evolved together. As states emerged, they began to recognize each other as peers, and they began to establish norms and eventually laws that would legitimize them. So that state violence not only becomes, in effect, de facto monopolized domestically, but internationally it also becomes the only mode of violence that is legitimized. Concretely, what that means is that all non-state actors, what we would in today's parlance talk in terms of transnational actors, these actors become progressively delegitimized, disarmed, and marginalized. So, for instance, think of such actors as pirates, privateers, mercenaries, all these private holders of violence, of armed violence, who at various periods in history had previously been used and sometimes encouraged by states. The relationship between the pirate and the privateer is instructive in this regard. Effectively, a privateer was merely a pirate who had obtained some license from a monarch or from other feudal actor to behave in this fashion, or at least to conduct piracy against the enemies of that monarch. So what we see over this period, and of course this is what happens in the centuries that lead up to the 20th century and to our present day, is that these actors are increasingly removed from the scene. So one might say, effectively, that organized violence in the modern era is progressively de-democratized, demarketized, and territorialized. It is de-democratized in the sense that instead of being widely distributed within the social order, it becomes concentrated, monopolized within the state, or states in an international state system. It becomes demarketized in the sense that it is no longer available to purchase in an open market. So mercenaries who had been relied upon previously by particularly city-states, but in fact all sorts of states or prior political actors, this is no longer possible to do so, no longer possible to offer these services on the market or to buy them on the market. And violence is, organized violence is territorialized. It becomes associated with a territory, again, the state territory. And all of this is achieved by a system of states, so that the monopolization of violence becomes a global systemic process. For example, the struggle or the fight against piracy. Eventually piracy is pushed out because a coalition of states agree to do away with piracy. Here on the image on the left, we see the signature of a treaty that was part of the wider Peace of Westphalia that was arrived to in 1648, conclusion of the 30 Years' War. And the Peace of Westphalia is significant and is invoked very often in international relations theory as the beginning of the modern international state system, or the so-called Westphalian state system. And leaving aside the controversies about how much of a simplification that dating is, and how, in fact, how incremental many of these changes were as opposed to being some foundational date. What is significant in the date of 1648 and what is in the Treaty of Westphalia is that it introduced notions of exclusive state sovereignty in a developing society of states, exclusively a European one, of course. But what the signatories to the Treaties of Westphalia agreed to is to refrain from intervening in the internal affairs of other states, leaving behind the religious disputes that had been the cause of the 30 Years' War. So it's important as a way of understanding how sovereignty is not merely something that happened on the ground, but was something that had to be recognized within a group of states. And to this day, sovereignty remains a predominant, one of the major central norms of international politics. The idea that states are endowed with sovereignty, and that this means that other states commit themselves not to intervene in their internal affairs. Of course, this is an inconsistently applied principle, but nonetheless, it's a powerful one, an important one. Now, returning to the monopolization of violence within states, one of the important trends to note is the way in which, as states progressively monopolize violence, we see a bifurcation, a splitting of the means of violence, of the institutions of organized violence, between, on the one hand, internal facing institutions of policing and external institutions of the military. Previously, the army, what we would call an army, was effectively the singular instrument of both external defense and internal compulsion. The power brokers who possessed means of violence used them to retain their authority within their own territories or areas of influence, and to combat other such actors. But with the modern nation state, what we start to see is this establishment of very specialized institutions. In particular, that of the police, which is an institution that actually comes quite late, really around the 19th century. It's not until the 19th century that European states establish nationwide police bureaucracies. And the lateness of that date is actually revealing, because it tells us that it's really only quite late in the process that this bifurcation happens. And the reason it happens is precisely as an effect of the success of previous monopolizations of violence. Because one of the key distinctions between a police force and a military force is that the degree of coercion, the degree of violence that needs to be deployed is considerably less. So if you can rely on a police institution to control and maintain a monopoly of violence domestically, it's because you've already attained a quite high level of pacification. You've already got a population that is largely quiescent, where you've effectively removed any of the significant rivals to power, so that you can now use a much lower level of coercion. One of the consequences of this, of course, which means that because states now have reduced costs of internal pacification, that they are not required to put as many resources, as much of their means of organized violence into maintaining domestic order, they are able to project greater amount of this force externally. And here it's important to understand the significance of popular legitimacy in all this. Because if the domestic terrain is easier to police, it's also because the central authorities have attained a higher degree of legitimacy. There's less contestation of that authority. And popular legitimacy also means the possibility of calling on greater popular resources for the purpose of war. Indeed, Bruce Porter offers us a useful taxonomy of the succession of dominant state forms. That's to say that the state form has evolved over time, and that one of the forms of its evolution is its relationship to popular legitimacy. The state begins, for Porter, in the form of a dynastic state. It is led by an aristocratic elite, again, kings or monarchs. This is the state of play in 1648 at the Peace of Westphalia. And these monarchies come in varieties of guise, absolutist or constitutional forms of monarchy. They have some forms of popular legitimacy, but this is still relatively weak. So they mostly have to wage war by relying on either mercenary forces or professional armies. Effectively, they have to pay to assemble armies. The sacrifices they can ask of their domestic populations are more limited. In contrast, we see from the French Revolution onwards the emergence of the nation state, so that the state increasingly becomes understood as the representative of a nation, of a national community. And so the political legitimacy of that state is all the more strengthened, because it sees itself no longer as being merely the emanation of the God-given right of an aristocratic lineage to rule, but it claims to be a representative of a national community. It grounds itself in a popular idea of sovereignty. And so, unsurprisingly, the nation-state, as first coalesced in the French Revolution and the Napoleonic successor, and then later in the various nation-states that emerge in the 19th century, entirely new states appear in this period, constructed around the idea of the nation. Italy, Germany in the first instance. These states, these nation-states, are able to call on much greater popular commitments to the acts, to the conduct of war. Most demonstrably, the levée en masse, the conscription of the French Revolution, where all Frenchmen were called upon to join the armed forces and to fight for the nation. Finally, Porter outlines the development of the collectivist state around the First and Second World Wars. This is a collective state in which the government has a much greater role of intervention in the economy and society, in which there is mass participation in politics, whether it takes the form of universal democratic franchises or simply mass populist politics. It's no longer possible to discount the role of the masses in political forms of expression. And we see the state much more involved, much more responsible for citizen welfare through policies that touch onto education, health, and housing. Again, this comes in variants. In a sense, the totalitarian state, whether in its fascist or communist guise, is really merely a mutation of the collectivist state that we might find in liberal states in this period. The state takes a growing role in every aspect of its societies. Of course, in the totalitarian case, an almost complete involvement in the day-to-day life and the minutiae of social existence. Now, this is not merely a story about how a state is able to draw greater resources into war by building up its popular legitimacy. It's also about how populations, as they become called up for war, as the state makes greater demands on them, these populations expect and demand concessions from the state, so that the state, in becoming more involved with the society, in building up new forms of legitimacy, is obliged to concede some of its authority, or at least to allow for various checks on its authority. The development of democratic states, of the balance of domestic powers between judiciary, parliamentary, and executive, and so forth. So what we see in this period is a succession of state forms that attain greater degrees of legitimacy, and along with this increased legitimacy, an intensification of the means available to states to wage war, since of course the period of the collectivist state in the first half of the 20th century is also the period of total war, where every single resource, where every single citizen, male or female, becomes involved in the war effort. And what we've done so far is to look at how the state emerged and how it increasingly monopolized violence and devised greater means to throw into the activity of war, which accounts notably for the expansion of the European state globally through empire. But we could also look at the history from the other way around. We could start from the experience and transformations of war from the early modern period onwards, and we could see how this in turn drove the rise of the nation state and granted it preeminence over other political entities.